Hey everyone, let's talk about fairness. What does a truly fair deal actually look like? It's something we all kind of have a gut feeling for, right? But imagine trying to build an entire economic system based on that feeling. Well, that's exactly what we're digging into today by looking at a fantastic article from the International Journal of Finance and Economics. It's called Bounding the Boundless, and we're zeroing in on Section 5, which unpacks a huge concept in Islamic economics: equality in exchange.
Okay, so let's jump right in. The absolute core idea here, the foundation for everything else, is a principle called al-mumathala. Basically, it means equality in exchange. Think of it like this. For any deal to be considered legit, the scales have to be perfectly, and I mean perfectly balanced. What you give is exactly equivalent to what you get. No hidden advantages, no unfair surplus. It sounds simple, but trust me, it's a profound idea that everything else is built on. All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to explore the why behind this whole idea. Then, we'll get into the prohibition of excess, or RIBA. After that, we'll look at how you actually measure what's equal, who gets the final say on fairness, and finally, how it all comes together to create a framework for fair trade. Sound good? Let's dive in.
Okay, first up, why this focus on a perfectly balanced exchange? Where does that expectation even come from? Is it just some old rule written down in a book? Or is it tapping into something, a bit more fundamental about who we are?
Well, according to the article, it goes way deeper than just law. It's about our basic human instinct. The logic is actually pretty straightforward. If we believe that we all have an equal right to life, to our faith, and to our property, then shouldn't our economic interactions reflect that very same equality? So a fair trade isn't just about good business, it's a direct extension of respecting each other's basic rights as people. And this is where it all really clicks. The source connects this gut feeling for fairness directly to Quranic principles that forbid unjustly taking someone else's property. So if trade is a legitimate way to acquire wealth, it has to be on one non-negotiable condition. It must be based on equivalent value. Any imbalance, any little bit of excess, isn't just a bad deal, it's considered an unjust gain. So, this intense focus on equality naturally leads us to its total opposite, the big thing that has to be avoided. And that brings us to one of the most critical concepts in all of Islamic finance: RIBA.
Now, the word riba itself literally translates to excess or growth. But, and this is the key point, in this economic context, we're not talking about the good kind of growth like profits from hard work. No, this is specifically a negative kind of growth. It's an unjust gain that gets tacked on, something you receive without providing any equivalent value in return.
And this brings us to a really crucial distinction. A permitted sale, which is known as al-buy, is defined by its perfect balance. But al-riba is something else entirely. It's the excess that gets added on top of an already equivalent exchange. It's that unjust surplus, the part that tips the scales unfairly, that is strictly prohibited. So you see this really powerful inverse relationship at work. By strictly forbidding unjust excess, the framework inherently mandates its opposite, perfect equality. The source is also really clear that this isn't just for buying and selling goods. This principle of balance applies just as much to social transactions, like giving a loan. Now, this all sounds great in theory, but it brings up a huge practical question, right? How do you actually determine if something is truly equivalent to something else, especially when you're dealing with totally different kinds of goods?
To answer that, the source points to the work of a scholar named Panipa Dati, and what he did was brilliant. He drew on a Quranic principle of reciprocal justice, the idea that a response should be exactly proportional to the initial action. He then applied that exact same logic to commerce. What you get back must be precisely proportional to what you give. The exchange has to be perfectly reciprocal.
And this logic leads to a really practical system for measuring fairness. For what the source calls homogeneous goods, things that are interchangeable, like a kilo of rice or a barrel of oil, equivalence is simple. You just measure it physically, by weight or by volume. But for distinctive goods, things that are one of a kind, like a house or a piece of art, you can't compare them physically. So their equivalence is measured by their agreed-upon market value, or their price. And this principle is applied very, very strictly to sales. If you're trading like for like, say gold for gold, the quantities have to be identical. That makes sense. But here's a fascinating detail. The exchange must also happen at the exact same time, on the spot. Why? Because the framework recognizes the time value of money. Getting something today is worth more than getting it tomorrow. Any delay creates an inherent imbalance, and that gives one side an unfair advantage.
This leads us to another fascinating question. Okay, we know how to measure equivalence, but who's the ultimate judge? Who gets to decide whether an exchange is actually fair?
The source draws a really sharp line here, and it all depends on the situation. In cases of restitution, let's say you broke your neighbor's window and you have to pay for it, an objective third party, like a judge, decides the fair value. But in a normal, voluntary sale, the power to determine fairness shifts entirely to the buyer and seller. Their mutual agreement is what defines the equivalent exchange.
This places an incredible amount of weight on the power of mutual consent. As long as both people are fully informed and they agree without any pressure, their shared decision on the price is the fair price. It's a fascinating idea, right? The subjective agreement between two people can actually override an objective external valuation from an expert.
So how do all of these principles come together in the real world? Let's look at how they form a practical framework for creating a just and fair marketplace.
I love this detail from the source. This wasn't just left to chance. There's this anecdote about Caliph Umar literally policing the market, testing traders on their knowledge of fair exchange rules to make sure they weren't accidentally dealing in riba. It shows that ensuring traders understood these rules was a matter of public policy. It was a leader's job to protect the market.
When you step back and look at the entire system of Islamic commercial law, you see it's all designed with a single purpose. Every rule, from standardizing money to defining the elements of a valid contract, it's all a piece of the architecture. The ultimate goal is to build an environment where both parties are empowered with the tools and the knowledge they need to judge equivalence for themselves and give their full informed consent.
And this brings us to the core principle that ties everything together. At its heart, this entire framework is designed to do one thing: ensure that every single transaction, whether it's buying groceries or giving a loan, is fundamentally balanced. It's a system built from the ground up to prevent anyone from gaining an unjust profit at someone else's expense.
And this leaves us with a final thought to chew on. In our modern economy, full of derivatives, complex financial instruments, and abstract value, what can we learn from a principle that is so fundamentally focused on tangible, demonstrable, and equal value in every single exchange? It's a compelling question to consider.